Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has flatly rejected calls from former Defense Minister Mykhailo Fedorov to hold wartime elections. Zelenskyy, who is currently meeting with leaders of Nordic and Baltic nations in Kyiv, compared holding elections during a war with Russia to a tsunami that could split Ukraine apart. Legally, elections are suspended in Ukraine due to martial law that was declared within the first hours of Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022. I'd like to welcome Harry Nedelcu, partner and senior director, Geopolitics at Rasmussen Global in Brussels. Harry, the Ukrainian president says wartime elections, as called for by the ex-defense minister Fedorov, could, quote, split Ukraine. Would you agree with that?
Well, it would be coming at a very difficult time for Ukraine. Now, we have to remember that the conversation around elections has been one that's come and gone throughout the war. And generally, the consensus is that, throughout, at least while the fighting is still happening, elections would be nearly impossible to carry out for a number of reasons. A lot of Ukrainians living abroad, millions of them, in fact, millions under Russian occupation, and then about 1 million under the military. So all these people have to be somehow brought into the electoral process. Impossible to do under current circumstances. But even more so now, actually, because we have to remember now we are going through a sequence in the war where air attacks are inflicting more and more damage and casualties, including civilian casualties. So quite difficult to hold elections at this time, even more so than perhaps a year or 2 years ago.
What do you make of the timing of Zelensky's statement? Why now?
Well, it's a response to the calls by former Defense Minister Fedorov, or at least the allusion for early elections, and therefore, it's coming to say that no, this is not an appropriate time for this.
So let's talk about Zelensky's position, his potential staying power. It appears he's under a lot of pressure. Of course, you could argue that he's been under extraordinary pressure for more than 4 years now. But does the fact that this is even a topic of conversation suggest he's particularly vulnerable?
In fact, it's the other way around. We have to remember the context in which the former defense minister called for early elections and the response from society. Right after his dismissal, there was quite a bit of public support, if you will, protests, probably the first protests of a larger magnitude since the ones in 2025. After Fedorov called for elections, in fact, those protests, they stopped. So ironically, actually, the call by the former defense minister for elections is closing this conversation, at least for now, and actually putting Zelenskyy in a stronger position now than before.
And what about Fedorov? Let's talk about him for a moment. The former Ukrainian defense minister does have significant support, I understand, especially among younger Ukrainians. Now he's calling for elections while also talking about corruption in the country. Is he positioning himself as a reformer above the fray, or does this risk looking like he's trying to settle the score after his firing?
Difficult to say, but the fact is Fedorov has been positioning himself as a reformer. He was seen as a reformer when he was a defense minister. I think, however, Fedorov may have made a small mistake. A miscalculation, if you will. He mistook or miscalculated the protests that came about right after his dismissal, which were protests, legitimate protests in favor of transparency, anti-corruption, and so on. But he mistook those as protests in favor of him, his person, as such. And I think that was a mistake, because actually what has happened is right after the call for elections, which protesters not agree with, the protests have dwindled and in fact even stopped. So in this sense, I think he may have miscalculated.
Ukraine has built some momentum in the war, attacking deep inside Russia, but Russia has been mounting sustained attacks as Kyiv struggles with defense shortages. There's a possibility the Kremlin could mobilize even more men after the parliamentary elections in September. How potentially dangerous is this debate in Ukraine at this critical moment? Or is it, as you were suggesting, essentially a non-starter, the whole issue of having elections?
Well, if the Kremlin were to mobilize even more soldiers, that would put even more pressure on the front lines, and therefore that would even decrease the chances of elections. However, I would say that right now, the let's say greatest risk to Ukraine is not so much on the front lines, where more or less, the situation is pretty much stable in that sense. Sometimes Ukrainians get some territory back. Sometimes the Russians might take a small territories here and there, but in general, it's pretty much stable. However, the largest risk is to Ukraine's cities, Russian air attacks, and the fact that Ukraine doesn't have the missiles that it needs in order to the interceptors it needs in order to counterattack that. So that is actually the biggest, I would say, challenge right now for Ukrainians, and also extremely difficult, again, when we talk about this question of elections, to have elections under a situation like that.
Only about half a minute or so, but realistically, could Ukraine hold credible elections before the war ends, or is this more about shaping the political battlefield for whenever that moment comes?
Very difficult, again, to see how elections can be held in this situation unless Ukraine gets some type of respite, some type of ceasefire, which would have to be probably enforced by international community, so that it can organize properly and hold these elections. I don't think that in the current situation, more so in the current situation where you have increasing air attacks on Ukrainian cities, where early elections could be held.
Got it. That is Harry Nedelcu from Rasmussen Global. Really appreciate your time and particularly your perspective.
Well, for more on this topic, let's speak now to Yevheniia Kravchuk in Kyiv. She is a member of the Ukrainian Parliament in President Zelenskyy's Servant of the People Party. Great to have you on DW News tonight. What conditions do you
Thank you
believe...
for having me.
What conditions do you believe need to be in place before Ukraine can hold free and fair national elections?
Well, obviously, the war has to be over, and we would not be having missiles and drones flying around every day in many, many Ukrainian cities. Right now, I'm in Kyiv, and we have an air raid alarm because of the 5 missiles that, well, it's between missile and drone that are flying to the left bank of the city. I'm on another bank, but, if they will move and I'll hear something in my window, I would excuse myself from the interview because it could be dangerous. And that's something that Ukrainians live through every day. So it's not just because of the legislation forbids. It's because the war is not normal situation for people, for elections, or, it's not normal to live, but we have to. It's been almost 5 years. And it's not that someone wants or someone doesn't want. Mykhailo wasn't speaking about elections when he was in the government for 7 years, almost 7 years. So first, when he started to speak about it, when he basically lost his position in the government during the reshuffle. And I can go on for many minutes explaining why we need to ensure the situation to the possibility for millions of Ukrainians abroad to vote, or those who are in the army. We have more than 1 million people in the army. Should they just leave the tranche and go to the rally, or maybe be a candidate, or how it will happen?
Right. Yeah, you mentioned there, Mykhailo, you were referring to, I'm assuming, the former Defence Minister, Mykhailo Fedorov. Now, there have been questions also being raised about democratic accountability during a prolonged period without elections. How do you respond to those concerns?
Well, again, Mykhailo didn't say any concerns when he was in the government for 7 years. But again, I do value what he has done on his position, both Minister of Digital Transformation and then for a short period, Minister of Defense. I voted for him as a member of parliament to give him this mandate. Now about the accountability. So accountability, it's not just obviously elections, right? So it's the normal institutions. We do have function in parliament, government, presidents, local governance. The local elections in local governments are not being held as well, but they still continue what they do. We have press that can write, very articles that might be unpleasant for the government. President just hold a meeting with journalists, I think a day or 2 days ago, explaining many things. Martial law does put restrictions, and these restrictions are for a reason. For example, not having possibility to have big rallies, and it is for a reason because Russians are throwing missiles to supermarkets. Yesterday in Kryvyi Rih, 16 people died buying food during the daylight. More than 100 wounded. I don't think it's difficult to explain unless you see it, unless you see that 10 years old boy who lost his father and his brother and crawls over the shattered glass,
Right.
all in blood because Russians sent a missile to a supermarket during the daylight.
I want to go back to something you mentioned there before, which was, for example, people serving in the military. If we kind of move forward a bit, what steps should be taken to ensure that Ukrainians serving, say, in the military, and also there are many Ukrainians also displaced abroad. What steps are being taken or should be taken so that in the future they would be able to participate in future elections?
So you're absolutely right. The preparation has to be done now. So we do have a working group in the parliament drafting the legislation for the first post-war elections, because we never had the elections that are either regular or early. We never had elections that should will be happening after the period of time. So we need a legislation for that. And you're absolutely right that a lot of people are displaced. We have half of the population of Ukraine that doesn't, their voting address doesn't match their current whereabouts. 30% out of them are in Ukraine, so they changed the region, so they need to be placed into the voting list in another region. And others, millions abroad. I mean, in Germany, there are more than 1 million of Ukrainians. And if you count the numbers of the election posts, which are basically our embassies and consulates, it's clearly not enough. So obviously, we would need to work, and we are working with different countries, whether they would help us open, I don't know, maybe 1,000 polling stations, or we'll end up changing the legislation so the voting day would be not just one day, but it will be prolonged so people could do it. And these working group where I'm as a member of parliament is in are working on each of the topics, and we're not nearly even I think it's like 60% of questions that have been resolved. And about the soldiers, well, obviously there should be demobilization, because if they are in the active duty, more than 1 million, and they have a position on the front, they cannot just say, I'm going to be a candidate, or I'm going to campaign, or I will help someone to campaign, because, they're not allowed to leave where they are. So the demobilization should happen.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there, Yevheniia, but great to have you on DW News tonight and to get your thoughts. Yevheniia Kravchuk, member of the Ukrainian Parliament in President Zelensky's Servant of the People Party. Thanks so much.
Thank you.